Hi there. It's time for Chapter 10 of School Days According to Humphrey. Chapter 10 is The Very Worst Day. That Monday was an unsqueakably difficult day. More difficult than any day we had last year in room 26. First, Thomas said that he had seen a wolf while he was walking to school, but Mrs. Brisbane got him to admit it might have just been a big dog. Mrs. Brisbane reminded him not to exaggerate. Worse yet, Phoebe had forgotten her spelling homework and burst into tears, which made me feel sad, sad, sad. Next, Mrs. Brisbane asked Paul to come up to the board for some math problems. And both Small Paul and Tall Paul jumped out of their seats. When they got up to the board at the same time, they glared at each other. The other students laughed. "Sorry, guys. I meant Paul G.," Mrs. Brisbane explained. Tall Paul turned red and Small Paul scowled as he returned to his seat. Small Paul liked to do math problems in front of the class. Tall Paul got the problem wrong and turned an even deeper shade of red. As if that wasn't bad enough, Kelsey skinned her knee at recess and had to go to the nurse's office. Then Mrs. Brisbane had an excellent idea, as she often does. She decided to put me in my ball and let me roll up and down the aisles. She probably wanted to get her students' minds off their problems. It would be very interesting if all humans could get a hamster's eye view of their world at least once. If they did, they'd probably clean their shoes more often. There really are unsqueakably awful things stuck to the bottoms of many shoes. Humans should pay more attention to their socks, too. On that day, both Thomas and Kelsey had on mismatched socks. They'd also realize how much they tap their feet and move around in general, even when they think they're sitting still. As I spin around the classroom, I'm always glad I have that ball to protect me. Despite the dangers, I kept rolling around lazily. The students were reading to themselves and after a while didn't even seem to notice me. As I approached Rosie's table, I decided it would be interesting to get a closer look at her wheelchair. I still hadn't figured out exactly how she would pop a wheelie. Rosie saw me coming closer, and her eyes sparkled. "Hi, Humphrey," she whispered. But when I got a little closer, Holly let out a yelp and grabbed my hamster ball, picking it up so quickly I was doing somersaults inside. "Eek!" I squeaked. "What is it, Holly?" the teacher asked. "Humphrey could trip up Rosie's wheelchair. He got way too close," she said, holding up the ball. "But I've got him now." "He wasn't too close," Rosie protested. "I saw him there." "I think it's dangerous," Holly said. "The way you picked him up is dangerous," Rosie replied. "You could have hurt poor little Humphrey." I don't like to think of myself as poor little anything, but she was right. I wasn't hurt, but I was definitely dizzy. "You must remember to be gentle with Humphrey," Mrs. Brisbane said as she took the ball from Holly. She peered in through the yellow plastic. "Are you all right?" I squeaked, though it was a weaker squeak than usual. Mrs. Brisbane put me back in the cage, satisfied that I was okay. I headed straight for my sleeping hut, which was the safest, quietest place I knew. I crawled out a little later when I heard Rolling Rosie ask if she could speak to Mrs. Brisbane. The room was empty because it was lunchtime. "You didn't pop a wheelie again, did you, Rosie?" the teacher asked. "No," Rosie answered. "It's about my assistant." "Holly?" Mrs. Brisbane said. "Why don't you tell me what's on your mind?" Rosie wheeled up to the desk, and she and Mrs. Brisbane talked. Og and I were as silent as could be so we could hear every word they said. I don't think I need an assistant, she explained. I can do almost everything myself. So could you tell Holly not to help me anymore? Mrs. Brisbane was silent for a moment. I could, she finally said. But do you really want me to? Yes, Rosie answered. I know Holly wants to help, but she helps way too much. She helps me when there's no problem at all. Sometimes she gets in the way. Have you told her that? Mrs. Brisbane asked. Rolling Rosie nodded. I said she didn't need to help so much. It didn't work. Again, Mrs. Brisbane was silent for a while. I can see you don't need much help, Rosie, but maybe Holly does, she finally said. Holly? Rosie sounded really surprised. She likes to help, Mrs. Brisbane explained. I think she'd be pretty upset if you said you didn't need her anymore. Maybe she could help someone else, Rosie answered. Let's give her one more chance, Rosie, Mrs. Brisbane said. I'll have a word with her and see if things improve, okay? Good old Mrs. Brisbane. She really knew how to handle students. Now, we'd better eat. I'm going to the lunchroom too. As they headed out of the classroom, I couldn't wait to talk to Og. Were you listening, Og? I asked my neighbor. Helpful Holly will be upset if she gets fired. I knew that because I'd probably be unsqueakably upset if I got fired from my job as a classroom hamster. Boing, 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 Og agreed, splashing in his water. I thought the day would never end, but at last the afternoon bell rang. As the students gathered up their backpacks, Mrs. Brisbane took a sheet of orange paper and approached Phoebe. Phoebe, I have an idea to help you remember your homework, she said. Each day we'll put a big, colorful reminder in your backpack so you won't miss it. What do you think? Okay, Phoebe said. I've written your homework assignment on it. All you have to do is remember to bring it back, Mrs. Brisbane continued. Phoebe nodded. I will, she promised. You can do it, Phoebe, I squeaked. Then I hopped on my wheel and started spinning as fast as I could. I think she was smiling when she left the room. The day took a turn for the better when some of my old friends from last year came to room 26. There was Raise Your Hand Heidi Hopper and her best friend Stop Giggling Gail Morgenstern, along with Repeat It Please Richie Rinaldi. I was spinning on my wheel when they came in, and I was so glad to see them. I stopped suddenly, and I almost tumbled off. Please don't make sudden stops when you're spinning on a wheel. Hi, I squeaked. I'm not sure they could hear me over the loud splashing sounds Og was making. Humphrey, my favorite hamster, Heidi said as she rushed up to my cage. Gail giggled. Og, my favorite frog, she said as she hurried to my friend's tank. And you're my favorite teacher, Richie told Mrs. Brisbane. Thank you, Richie, she replied. But you have to give Miss Becker a chance. She's an excellent teacher. I know, Richie said, but she doesn't have any classroom pets. Heidi leaned in close to my cage. I'm doing pretty well raising my hand this year, Humphrey, she told me. That was unsqueakably good news. Mrs. Brisbane and I had worked hard to help her end her bad habit. Boing, boing, Og twanged, sending Gail into peals of laughter. I don't think Gail could ever stop giggling completely. At least I hope not. I was so glad to see my old friends from last year, I jumped on my wheel and started spinning fast, which made them all giggle. Go, Humphrey, Richie said. Then Og decided to dive into the water side of his tank and make an extra big splash, which made them giggle even louder. "Awesome, Og," Heidi said. "I think Og and Humphrey are glad to see you," Mrs. Brisbane said. "Oh, Mrs. Brisbane, we miss them so much," Heidi said. "We came to ask you something important." I slowed down the wheel. "You say it, Richie," Gail said. "Okay." Richie suddenly looked serious and cleared his throat. "Mrs. Brisbane, we don't think it's fair that you have 2 classroom pets in room 26 and we don't have any in room 18. We were hoping you'd donate one of yours to Miss Becker." Thank goodness I'd hopped off my wheel or I'd have fallen over. I was really, really, really surprised. And so was Mrs. Brisbane. "Goodness, I don't think my students would like that," Mrs. Brisbane said. "If Miss Becker wants a classroom pet, she can get her own. But I'm not sure she wants one." "She'd like Humphrey or Og. Everybody does," Gail said. "And Og came here from another classroom," Heidi said. "At least ask her, please," Richie begged. Mrs. Brisbane was unusually quiet. I was too, and I didn't hear a boing or a splash from Og. "Please." Gail looked so serious I could hardly believe it was her speaking. "Please," Heidi added. At last Mrs. Brisbane spoke. "To tell you the truth, I can't imagine giving up either one of them. Don't you think they'd miss each other?" Heidi and Gail glanced at each other. "They weren't always together," Humphrey said. "Humphrey was alone in the beginning," Richie said. "I had to squeak up for myself, but it was so lonely at night, even scary. I'd almost forgotten how loud the clock sounded in the empty room and how long the nights were without someone splashing nearby." "Boing, boing," Og agreed. "Boing, boing, boing." That made Gail giggle, of course. Mrs. Brisbane smiled. "I'll tell you what, I'll think about it. And I'll talk to Miss Becker about classroom pets. But I'm just not sure it's a good idea to separate Humphrey and Og and take one of them away from my class." "Thanks, Mrs. Brisbane. We really miss them," Richie said. They chatted with the teacher for a few more minutes, and then it was time for them to go home. After they left, Mrs. Brisbane leaned in close to my cage and stared at me. "To tell the truth, I can't imagine teaching without you and Og to help me," she said. "Am I just being selfish?" "No, no, no," I squeaked at the top of my tiny lungs. Miss Brisbane chuckled. "I don't think Arlene Becker wants any classroom pet. Not even you," she said. "So don't worry." "Thanks," I squeaked. "I won't." But I did. I worried and worried and worried some more. And even though he hatched from an egg and was cold-blooded, I could tell that Og was worried too. Humphrey's rules of school. It's actually possible to be too helpful. Have a great evening.